So in my last lecture, I described the course of the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 to 1919. And I also addressed the question of why it killed so many people globally. So as I discussed, researchers have different theories about why the flu virus became so deadly in 1918. And they also disagree about why it targeted young adults at such high rates, unlike most other viruses and diseases, including other flu viruses. So what is clear is that it was uniquely deadly. It probably killed somewhere between 50 and 100 million people worldwide, according to the latest estimates. And this would mean that it killed far more people than the First World War did. It probably killed more people than the Second World War did. And it's possible, at the higher range of these estimates, that it killed more people than both world wars combined did. So you would think that with an event of this magnitude, that you would have an immediate and deep impact on the societies it struck. But the Spanish flu actually seems to have passed as quickly as it came, and it left few obvious traces. It did not, on the face of it, dramatically reorder the social or political order of most of the countries it struck. It didn't appear to enter into the public memory in any meaningful way. There was relatively little discussion of it after the fact. There were few or virtually no memorials erected to commemorate the victims of the pandemic. Now, there are several reasons, I think, that it failed to take hold in the historical memory. The first and probably most important of these was that it was overshadowed at the time and since by the First World War, by this other event of arguably even greater magnitude. So I've already discussed the importance of the fact that the pandemic came at the tail end of this war. I looked at how it might have been made worse by wartime conditions. The war probably played some role in its genesis, in causing the flu virus to come about as such a deadly form when it did. And it may also have played a role in its spread through troop movements and movements of laborers serving the war effort. But the war also played an important role distracting attention from the pandemic and from the drama that was unfolding as a result of the pandemic. This was because economic and social upheavals in many countries had already been brought with the outbreak of war in 1914, and as the war deepened and became more and more total over the coming years. And this was the case not only for the belligerents, for the countries that were fighting in the war, but also for many other countries around the world that were dragged into it in different ways. What also probably lessened attention for the pandemic was the fact that mass death as a result of the war was already in the order of the day by 1918 and 1919. So the flu, for many people at the time and since, have seemed like part of this bigger story of the war. The war was the big event, and the flu was one of many smaller catastrophes in people's views that took place within this broader context. Now, I think this view, among other things, reflects the Western perspective that has dominated accounts of the Spanish flu pandemic. It was only in a handful of European states that the war actually killed more people than the flu did. And so it was only in these states that the pandemic could be treated really as a footnote to the war in terms of its impact, at least in terms of deaths. The vast majority of the pandemic's victims were outside of Europe and the United States, as I mentioned in my last lecture. These were the areas that had the lowest case fatality rate. Higher percentages of people who fell ill ended up dying in the rest of the world. In fact, India alone is thought to have suffered somewhere around 18 million deaths as a result of the flu. So that's probably more deaths than the First World War caused globally in all countries. But the story of these other countries outside of Europe and the United States are largely untold. And this focus on Western experiences has distorted the picture of the pandemic and made it subordinate in a way to the First World War. I think a second reason that it has failed to take hold in historical memory is the fact that the pandemic defies many of the narrative conventions we're used to adopting when discussing historical events. It didn't have a clear beginning, or a clear end. So I've discussed there are efforts to try to pinpoint when it leapt over from animals to people, but this might not ever be possible. And as I also discussed, it's not really clear when it precisely it ended. Historians often point to the third wave, but it's not even clear exactly what were the last cases of flu to be part of this wave, as opposed to other cases of flu or illness. There are also very few heroes or villains in the story. And in fact, human agency seemed to play only a peripheral role at the time. The story of the pandemic seemed like an act of God or a force of nature. Human decision-making, human actions seemed not to be playing much role in affecting it one way or the other. It was a major catastrophe, but a natural catastrophe in the view of many people, unlike something like the war. And this meant that it was much harder to appropriate or memorialize it for political purposes after the fact. Finally, and I think the third reason, is that it's quite difficult to tease out the direct consequences on politics or society, to draw out the effects and in that way make sense of this story of the flu pandemic. Now, this is not to say, of course, that the pandemic did not have effects, and it probably had very profound ones. But the problem is it's very difficult to pinpoint what these were. It was so universal, so widespread, so fast, that much of the efforts to figure out what it did, what it affected, rest on speculation about what would have been had it not struck. So these are exercises in counterfactuals that are often very hard to prove or substantiate. Now, there are some clear cases we can point to of effects it had. And the clearest of these that often are raised are the instances of noteworthy individuals whose lives were on the track for promising careers or for greatness of some sort, but were cut tragically short as a result of the flu. So one famous example that often is brought up is the Vienna artist Egon Schiele. You see here in his sickbed. He died at the end of October 1918, 3 days after his wife, who was then 6 months pregnant. And when this story is told, it's often brought up in reference to his last major work. You can see here called The Family, which people often take to be an imagined representation of his family, which was never going to come to be. Schiele was 28 at the time he died, and he was on the cusp of becoming Austria's greatest artist after Gustav Klimt had died in the previous February. The French poet and the pioneer of surrealism, Guillaume Apollinaire, died a little over a week later at the age of 38. Another instance of someone who had already achieved a great deal, and many people think would have achieved more had he not been struck down by the flu. And you can see the ways that these people are very young, 28 and 38 years of age. So they may have had great careers ahead of them. But this also underscores one of the problems, or one of the difficulties in pinpointing the effects of the flu, which is many of the people at the time who were most prominent in military and politics and culture were spared because they were over 40. They'd had enough time in their lives and in their careers to already achieve a great deal. And therefore they were in an age range that tended not to die in as high numbers. So other scholars have made much grander claims about the effects of the pandemic. Some have suggested that the flu pandemic contributed to the outcome of the First World War. And this is because of its timing and how it struck the armies of both sides. Its spring wave, which began in March, as I mentioned, and lasted until summer of 1918, came at a decisive moment in the conflict. Russia had just left the war following the revolution there, the Bolshevik takeover, and American troops were only beginning to land in Europe in spring of 1918, after America had entered the war the previous year on the Allied side. So in a sense, replacing Russia in the alliance with France, Britain, Italy, and other states. The German general, Erich Ludendorff, pictured here, who was the major planner on the German side, came up with a plan for a spring offensive, which would be a last-ditch effort to break the stalemate on the Western Front. The Western Front had begun with the War of Movement as armies moved a great deal in an effort to break the other side, but it quickly degenerated into trench warfare, into two stable lines, more or less stable lines, since the end of 1914. And so he came up with a plan to break this stalemate, to punch through the trench lines and to defeat the British and the French quickly through a series of rapid attacks that would overcome the defenders on the other side. And the hope was that this would lead to a quick victory for the Germans before the American manpower and resources would make the war unwinnable for Germany. So surprise and speed were key parts of this plan. That was the key to the plan was the timing. Victory had to be achieved as quickly as possible. And the offensive got off to a good start. It caught the defenders off guard through its daring and through certain tactical innovations on the German side. They drove through Allied defenses. And by early June, they'd made the biggest breakthrough in the West since the war had begun, or since a few months after the war had begun, since the trench systems had first been stabilized in autumn of 1914. By this point, they were 40 miles from Paris, but then the offensive ground to a halt. Ludendorff, who conceived it, later blamed his failures that summer, at least partly, on the flu, which was in fact raging through the German army in May and June of 1918. Of course, Ludendorff was someone who was happy to pin blame on anyone or anything other than himself, rather than face his own failures. He later became a leading proponent of the so-called stab in the back legend that claimed that Jews, socialists, and other defeatists at the home front in Germany were the ones who were responsible for German defeat in the war, rather than Germany's military and political leadership for failures on their part. But some scholars today also support the view that the flu played an important, maybe even a decisive role. The leading proponent of this view is the political scientist Andrew Smith Price. He notes that this wave struck the German army harder than it struck the Allied side. But even if it had not struck the Germans harder, an outbreak of the flu would have played a bigger role in an army that was launching a major offensive, that had to advance. Now, we've noted that the spring wave was milder. It didn't kill as many people as the second wave that came in the fall of 1918, but it still was extremely contagious and it was debilitating. People got quite ill, were not able to act with the same energy, often ended up sick in bed. So his argument is that the widespread of the flu in the German army meant that this offensive could not move as forcefully or as quickly as planned, and that led to its collapse. But it's very difficult to determine precisely how large a role the flu actually played in the failure of Germany's offensive and in the broader course of the war. By June of 1918, even healthy soldiers in the German army were getting tired by this relentless pace of their advance. The idea was to keep moving, and this was exhausting to them. And they were also outrunning their supply lines. The further they pushed into Allied territories, the less able they were to bring up supplies. They no longer had the train tracks, the rail network behind their defensive lines. And so it became more and more difficult to keep supplied and to maintain the advance. This was a common problem during the First World War when armies launched offensives. When they had success, often they would overstretch their supply lines. And as they advanced, they were also meeting more and more fresh and well-armed American soldiers and also American armaments that were also supplying the Western side. More than 200,000 American soldiers were arriving in Europe each month from May of 1918 through to the war's end. So it's very hard to imagine that the French and the British would simply surrender at this moment when the broader balance of power had so clearly turned in their favor as a result of the American entry into the war. So it's possible the German offensive would not have collapsed so quickly in the summer of 1918 without the flu pandemic. It's possible the Germans would have made it farther, perhaps would have even captured Paris. But it's more doubtful, in my view, that this pandemic shifted the war's outcome significantly. I think something similar could be said about another event that some scholars claim was influenced by the flu or was driven by the flu pandemic, And this was the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, or the Habsburg monarchy. Again, Andrew Smith Price is a major proponent of this view, and he suggests that the flu pandemic partly caused this because of the failures of governance. Now, it's true that the monarchy collapsed over the course of October and November of 1918, at the very moment when this pandemic struck its lands the hardest. Austria-Hungary was largely spared the first wave, it seems, but as a consequence, probably, it suffered even harder than many other countries the second wave, this deadly wave. And it's probably true that the flu did contribute to the widespread sense of disillusionment with the monarchy and exhaustion on the side of the public and on the side of the people who would have been necessary to hold together the empire. But historians usually point to much more immediate and also more long-term effects or causes of the breakup. On the one hand, the shock of losing the war, which probably was a much bigger shock than this pandemic to many people within the empire in terms of delegitimizing the monarchy, and also rising national sentiment, which had been brewing for decades at this point among the empire's various minorities. These are usually the two reasons historians give as the preeminent ones driving the breakup of the empire. And it's difficult to see the flu being more important than these, even if it did play some role. The historians Alfred Crosby and the author John M. Barry have suggested that the pandemic also played an important role in changing the course of peacemaking after the First World War, and that the flu affected the peace treaties that ended the war. Their argument rests on the fact that Woodrow Wilson, the president of the US, suddenly fell ill in April 1919 at the critical moment in negotiations over the peace conference between the various victors of the war, especially the French, the British, and the Americans, who all were pursuing their own geopolitical interests. Now, usually his illness is interpreted as a minor stroke. Wilson had a series of strokes in his life. Eventually, a stroke would debilitate him. But they argue, looking at the symptoms of this illness he had in Paris, such as coughing, fits, and a fever, that it was in fact the flu. And it's true that flu was running rampant in Paris, the third wave of the flu, at this point in April 1919. And they also suggest that his weakness as a result of this illness at this critical moment in negotiations made him less able to push through his vision of a just peace, a peace without victory. He was often a moderating influence in negotiations with regards to how Germany should be treated in the peace treaty. So this is intriguing speculation, but it's unverifiable. It's very difficult to prove whether this is the case or not. For one thing, because the nature of Wilson's illness remains unclear, so it's not clear whether this really even was the flu. For another, that it's difficult to know how the treaty would have looked had he remained healthy. Wilson was not extraordinarily consistent anyways with his goals. He had lofty ideals, but often the details deviated, or he wasn't sure what he wanted to do in details in negotiations. And historians debate how important the Versailles Treaty was and the harsh provisions of it were to the later course of history, because Crosby and Barry's argument rests on this idea that the harsh treaty led to many of the catastrophes of the 1930s and 1940s. So Alfred Crosby himself actually acknowledged his very speculative nature and the difficulty of describing the pandemic's impact in his major book on the Spanish flu, when he wrote, quote, "The pandemic affected history in general in the way that random addition of a poison to some of the refreshments served at the 1918 West Point commencement celebrations would have affected the military history of World War II, i.e. it had an enormous influence, but one that utterly evades logical analysis and that has been completely ignored by all commentators on the past." So he wrote this in a book, as you can see, entitled America's Forgotten Pandemic, which was originally published in 1989, republished in 2003. And at the time, his title captured, I think, well, the way in which the pandemic had largely been forgotten, had largely vanished from memory, or been treated as a footnote of the First World War, not only in the US, but in most of the world. But since then, the interest in the Spanish flu has exploded. And there are many reasons for this. I think the most important is a growing awareness that something like this could happen again. For decades after the Spanish flu outbreak, humanity seemed to be marching steadily towards a victory over infectious disease. Vaccinations became more and more common. Antibiotics were invented, were discovered, and other new treatments came out that brought a series of deadly illnesses under control, at least in advanced countries, but also spreading to other countries. But this began to change towards the end of the century. The HIV/AIDS crisis of the 1980s and 1990s shook the widespread faith that humanity was winning in its struggle against contagious diseases. The mid to late 1990s and early 2000s also saw the arrival of several new strains of influenza or flu-like viruses that appeared to raise the specter of a repeat of 1918 and 1919. For instance, the H5N1 avian flu in 1996 was an extremely deadly flu that was shown capable of leaping over to humans. The SARS virus pandemic in 2002 to 2004, the H1N1 swine flu of 2009. All of these illnesses, which came from animals to people, caused concern that a global pandemic would arrive that would kill millions. This last flu, the H1N1 swine flu, was actually a descendant of the Spanish flu, and it continued circulating in pig populations after disappearing from human populations in the mid-20th century when it was replaced by another influenza strain. And now it returned to human hosts, although fortunately proved far less deadly than at first expected. Together, these events sent many historians of science and other scientific researchers to look again at the 1918 to 1919 pandemic for clues about how pandemic diseases can emerge and how they spread, and also for lessons about how to fight them when the next one comes. And this brings us to the final question I want to address in my lecture, which is, what are the lessons we can draw from the Spanish flu pandemic for today's crisis, for this pandemic we're facing now? I'm sure many of you have seen over the past few months, there have been hundreds, maybe thousands of commentaries in the press and elsewhere that have compared COVID-19 to the Spanish flu. They're both very different viruses, it's true, but they have very similar symptoms. They're severe respiratory illnesses. And many of the images from 1918 that are being reprinted now suddenly seem very familiar. For a long time, they seem so distant and strange and unfamiliar. But now they resemble everyday life in many countries. Face masks were widely used in 1918 in order to prevent the spread of the flu, although there were debates about their effectiveness, much like today. There were also public campaigns aimed at educating people on how to limit transmissions. And these also are similar to things that we see today. Now, there are many significant differences in the two illnesses, different viruses. Crucially, COVID-19 disproportionately strikes the elderly rather than young adults. It's not striking down, by and large, people in the prime of their lives, although obviously some are suffering from it quite severely as well. And the context is also very different. Our world is not a world in the grips of a world war, of a global conflict. It's also important, and many commentators have pointed this out, that the science of disease was far behind our own back in 1918. Today, we know the face of the enemy. We know what the coronavirus looks like. This is because electron microscopes and other advanced imaging techniques have made the virus visible. The science of genetics means that scientists can understand viruses much better. They have a rough understanding of how viruses operate, how they reproduce. And this is the kind of knowledge that experts in 1918 completely lacked. Electron microscopes were only developed in the 1930s. So at the time of the Spanish flu pandemic, viruses had been theorized. Scientists had believed something existed that was smaller than bacteria, and they even called them viruses, but they were not actually able to confirm their existence visually, to prove that they were real things. Scientists certainly did not know what they were or how viruses worked. In fact, in 1918, most health experts falsely believed that the flu was caused by bacteria, not by a virus. And the culprit behind it, they believed, was a bacteria called Bacillus influenzae, which was first described by the German scientist Richard Pfeiffer as the cause of the flu in the 19th century, and had after that become known as Pfeiffer's bacillus. Now, ignorance about the cause of the flu and fear of the flu led to a number of measures that were either useless or counterproductive. A whole raft of drugs were given out in the hopes that they would fight the flu. Various things that were used to treat other diseases. For instance, the anti-malarial drug quinine. And here we have seen an eerie parallel to recent developments in the fight against COVID-19, where anti-malarial drugs are also being repurposed for the fight against this disease with relatively limited scientific backing so far. Enormous hopes were also placed in vaccines in 1918. Many people thought that some vaccine could be quickly developed to save humanity from this pandemic. And local health offices across the US and in other countries produced a whole range of vaccines based on samples taken from sick patients within their jurisdictions. Now, it's easy when we look back on 1918 to stress how little the people knew at the time. But I think it's also important to note the ways that these responses are similar to ones we're seeing today. And to see more broadly that perhaps today we are not so scientifically advanced as we like to think. And maybe people in 1918 were not so primitive. In fact, as much as medicine has advanced over the past century, its advances were probably even more incredible in the century preceding that, in the 100 years or so before 1918. For most of modern history, at least in Europe and the US, the prevailing theory of disease was known as the miasma theory. And this held that something like bad air was the cause of disease. So the idea that it was environmental. Diseases were caused by something in the environment. It was really only in the 1850s that the modern germ theory of medicine began to emerge. And this stressed the role of infectious agents, invisible bacteria, viruses, and other agents in causing disease that could be transmitted from person to person. And knowledge of this kind brought new ways to fight diseases, vaccines, better sanitation measures aimed at preventing transmission, and other public health measures. It's true that the flu pandemic of 1918 to 1919 shook some of the confidence in this, but great progress had been made, and it also spurred further research, and more progress was made. As I mentioned earlier, there would be a widespread faith that infectious diseases would be conquered soon after that. So I think one lesson from 1918 is that we should not be overconfident today about medical science rescuing us. Many viruses, including the flu, have proven over the past decades to be stubbornly resistant to cures, to efforts to find some cure. So I think it's important to see that SARS-CoV-2 might be with us for a very long time. We can hope that the mutations will make it less and less virulent over time, as happened with the 1918 flu virus. But we should be prepared for that not to be the case. We should be prepared also that a vaccine will not save us in short order. Many people place hope that we'll have a vaccine quickly, but other experts warn that it could take years or longer. And looking at 1918, I see parallels. Now, the experiences of the Spanish flu also provide some clues about how best to combat the spread of respiratory ailments like the flu or like COVID-19. In fact, many of the public health measures we've been seeing introduced across the world in the past weeks were developed with an eye to the experiences of 1918. Public health experts have been worried increasingly about the threats of these kind of viruses since the 1990s, as I mentioned. And in 2005, after reading a book by John M. Barry about the Spanish flu pandemic, George W. Bush, then president, directed his government to undertake preparations for a future pandemic. And the experts looked at the historical record from 1918. And because at the time there was fairly limited federal response to the pandemic, the measures that were introduced in a very patchwork manner across the US. So in states, in municipalities, in towns, different measures were put in place. And this meant that planners had a sort of natural experiment for assessing the effectiveness of different interventions in fighting the flu. And what emerged from these studies was a plan to close schools and many businesses, to ban most public gatherings, and to introduce guidelines for limiting personal interactions. And the term social distancing entered the lexicon of planners to describe these efforts at the time. Many planners continue now to look at the experiences of 1918 when they're trying to predict what will happen. For instance, there's been recent research that suggested that American cities that imposed the lockdowns earliest and longest had the lowest death rates, and also the largest return to employment once measures are relaxed. And this has guided some advice from public health experts about how we should behave moving forward. But I think it's also important to note that the Spanish flu offers few clues about the broader economic and social costs of a disease like this, and of the efforts to fight a disease like this. There are limits to the guidance it can provide in the terms of public health interventions we should or can impose. And this is mostly because the world of 1918 was very different than our world, because of this broader context of the World War. For most industrialized countries, and not just the belligerents, the war had already brought profound transformations to life. As I've mentioned, governments already were intruding more and more into daily life. The rapid pace of globalization that had been taking place since the late 19th century had been halted as a result of the war, and would go into reverse as a result of the war and of the Great Depression a decade later. Information did not flow as quickly or freely as it does today. Many governments censored information about the flu. So though it killed tens of millions of people, maybe even 100 million people worldwide, the Spanish flu did not disrupt life globally in the way that COVID-19 is doing today. So I think if the history of the Spanish flu offers warnings about the dangers of a global pandemic, and also gives us some hints about the public health measures that can best fight it, we really have no roadmap for the recovery and for what is to come.